Welcome to Chatham House for this members event. My name is Michael Keating. I'm a senior consulting fellow here. And prior to joining Chatham House, I was in Afghanistan for a couple of years with the UN until November. I'm really delighted that there are so many of you here today. It really shows the pulling power of Afghanistan still, so it's wonderful that we've got such a good turnout. Let me say at the outset that this event is being held on the record and live streamed for members, so be aware that what you say is going to be out there. And I'd be grateful if those of you who have cell phones could either switch them off or turn them to silent. We have three very distinguished speakers. Let me say we did try and get the gender balance slightly more balanced, but for various reasons it didn't work out. But I'm really delighted to have such three great speakers today. First on my right is Dr. Rob Johnson, who's going to address the issue of how the departure of the international military will affect security for Afghans and what's the best way to maintain security beyond 2014. Rob is the director of the Changing Character of War program at Oxford University. His research interest includes conflicts among people in Afghanistan, strategy, operations, insurgency, and counterinsurgency. And you're a specialist advisor to the British, Danish, American, and Afghan armed forces only on security, stabilization, and transition. And he's also the author of The Afghan Way of War and used to be with the British Army. On his right is Matt Waldman, who's worked on Afghanistan since 2005, first as Oxfam's head of policy in Afghanistan. He's now a fellow in the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. He's an analyst and was also a UN official in Afghanistan until about June 2011, involved in promoting dialogue and conflict resolution with the Taliban. His background is as a lawyer, and he's worked in foreign affairs and defence as an advisor to the UK and European parliaments. And on my left is Jawed Nader from Ghazni province in Afghanistan. Extensive experience of working with civil society, international and Afghan, as well as government. He's the director of the London-based British and Irish Agencies Afghanistan Group, BARG, and he was previously director of the Afghanistan Land Authority in the Afghan Ministry of Agriculture, and advocacy manager with the Afghan Civil Society Forum. So welcome and thank you all very much for doing this. What we will do is invite the three speakers to make some short presentations, and I've been enjoined to be very strict about this so that we have a good half hour for discussion, and we will try and end, as per the Chatham House tradition, sharply at 2 o'clock. So if I may ask Rob to kick off on how the departure of the international military will affect security for Afghans and what's the best way to maintain security beyond 2014. And may I also ask, abuse my privilege as the chair, do you think that we have an over-militarized view of security in Afghanistan?
Gosh, well, first of all, thank you very much for such a warm introduction, Michael, and such a challenging question to get us started. I think, let me say the first difficulty we have here is about what models we are thinking about, what trends we think we're identifying, how selective we want to be about sort of previous histories here, because so often when people start talking about security, the very first thing that people do is reach for examples historically and say, it's a repeat of something we know about Afghan history, and there's a wonderful Pashtun proverb which says that you can swallow a rough bone, but once it's in your bowels, it tends to cut at your guts. And I'm very grateful for those who've pointed out that quote to me in the past. That, of course, is an indication of how emotive this piece of history is. We know that bits of Afghan history are used very selectively. And our understanding of security is based entirely on a model, a Western model of what is security. As well, I'm sure we'll hear from Javed. I mean, one of the interesting things about security for many Afghans is that food security, water security, their families' security, other than the physical security being provided by Western forces, is what matters. So let's get that said first of all. I think the other caveat, very quickly, is that we are dominated at the moment in all analyses by very short-term perspectives. We tend to be only seeing, even when we talk about post-2014, really it seems to me that we're talking about the present still. And I think if we're going to be realistic about looking at security post-2014, we need to be thinking very long-term indeed. Again, I think this is where our colleagues in development have an advantage. The stability and equilibrium I think we're looking for are in sight, actually, but a long way down the road. And I think the short-termism of instability is still going to be with us. So let me just also make one other important remark about this too. We tend to see security as an issue only in Western terms. We forget quite often what Afghans are currently doing about their own security. There is a great deal of evidence that there's collusion going on, if you want to use that word, between Afghan security forces and those people we might think are local people or indeed insurgents. People are hedging for the future and increasingly committing for the future. They are negotiating at a local level already for local stability and local security, regardless of what the West thinks it's doing in terms of transfer of power. But I've been asked to talk, specifically, your question is very much about two things. One is the ISAF departure, and the other one is really the ways and means in which we provide security. Let me just quickly deal with those. A lot of focus at the moment is on the capability of the Afghan National Security Forces. A lot of the ISAF material that's coming out is about whether they've got the right logistics, the right transport, the right equipment, the weapons and the pay and so on and so forth. Really, frankly, we should be talking about cohesion of the Afghan security forces. That is what really matters the most. And that's based on things like leadership, professionalisation of leadership, on morale, on commitment, on the competing loyalties within the Afghan polity or the Afghan community writ large. So that's something that hopefully we can pick up on with the questions. There are obviously many risks and many opportunities. The risks I think we are currently missing about security is what happens to those who are currently, for example, the drivers of a lot of the haulage firms which are bringing a lot of food and equipment into Afghanistan for the benefit of ISAF. What happens, for example, in the next 2 years that they decide this is no longer in their interest to continue this sort of thing? That will seriously hamper the idea of transition to an Afghan national security leader, because the Western powers will be trying to find ways of protecting their own people as they come out. Another major risk factor, though, is increasing disobedience and desertion, I think we'll see within Afghan security forces. That is a major risk factor. And for Afghans, opportunism, of course. Opportunity for the acquisition of property, for goods, for exploitation of those they would consider to be weaker than themselves as they try to hoard and acquire material. I think increasing hoarding more generally, both not just of money, as we're seeing at the moment, but also of a lot of other goods and services. And I think the replacement at a local level of weak Giroa, as they call it, government of Afghanistan officials, by those who have got muscle, those who can provide security. And that may mean the Afghan security forces. Let me lastly deal then with this issue of what are the ways and means, what are the ways forward. I think we have to first of all set very clear objectives. I think there's been an absence of clarity about what objectives there have been. And it may be that if the priority is the stabilisation of Afghanistan, then that stabilisation we may have to consider now without the current system of governance in Afghanistan. If the Karzai government is as bankrupt as we think it might possibly be, then we need to start planning for a future that does not have that government in place. Secondly, I think we need to be honest about genuine Afghan solutions. There's been a lot of talk about Afghanising security, and that's usually around this word, the Afghan National Security Forces. But I think we need to seriously think about genuine Afghan solutions, which will mean compromises. We talk a lot about power sharing. We comfort ourselves with that expression, power sharing. I think the reality is, historical precedent is, that actually the moment you try to commit to some sort of power sharing is the period of greatest instability and violence. Finally, just a couple of words then about what are the means, other than this prioritisation or genuine Afghan solutions. What are the means? At the closing stages of the Iraq War, there was a lot of emphasis on private security contractors. They, of course, will go where the money is. If that money is not there, they will not be there. And there's been a great deal of antagonism between private security companies and the Afghan government, which think that makes it unlikely that's a solution. The Afghan security forces themselves, I think, will need to focus on holding urban areas and concentrating on the borders. And what we may have to contemplate, and this may seem an outrageous thing to say, but I'm going to say it because that's the thing that one has to do as a thinker, is to think the unthinkable, and that is that we may have to start licensing the poachers as gamekeepers. We may need to seriously bring on board, at a local level, local people providing their own security, and that may mean bringing those people who've formerly been insurgents into some form of licensed local security force. The historical precedent of that, of course, is that the Afghan security forces traditionally and historically always were a mixed force, both of regular and localised militia-like security apparatus. And I think that's the thing we probably need to sort of start looking at. I'm not going to say about Pakistan, because I think Matt may well want to say something about that, perhaps at some stage. Concluding points are, and if I've still got a moment to say it.
You've got 1 minute, yeah.
I've got a minute, so let me just conclude with my minute. That's to say that prediction clearly is extremely difficult. As an historian, it goes against my DNA to try and do anything like prediction. But I think we have to be extraordinarily cautious about trying to say, oh, well, in 2020 it will all look like this, won't it? And as we're confident that we find in the media at the moment, people predicting disaster and so on. Afghans are the best policy I know for actually local negotiations and finding local accommodations. I think we should have more faith that perhaps now, more than ever, is the greatest opportunity for negotiated settlements, because we've reached an impasse in the security environment. No one party in Afghanistan, including ISAF, has sufficient strength to dictate a solution. It seems to be a great opportunity now for that sort of talk. And I think the long-term solutions, say, we should keep in mind all the time, the solutions that go out to 2020, 2025, not trying to judge 2014, 2015 by the standards of what's going on now in 2013. I think that's very, very important. I'll stop there because I think there's lots we can talk about.
Great, that's very helpful. We do need to come back to the question whether is peaceful political transition in Afghanistan possible, and I hope that our questions will focus on that. Jawed, you are going to address the issue of the sustainability of development support for Afghanistan and whether more can be done with less. My observation would be that something like 90% of the revenues available to Afghanistan are provided by the international community, whether for development activities or the military. These are going to decrease. How can it be sustainable?
Very good question. Thank you for the introduction too, and it's a pleasure to be here among you today. I'd like to start with the story of an acquaintance that I thought his honesty was a little shaky, but he did tell me that in 2006 he worked with the International Army headquarters in southern Afghanistan. They needed rope, and he was sent to the nearest city, Kandahar, to fetch some 400 meters of rope. What he did was he mistakenly put a zero at the end of the final sum. So the rope that could cost him roughly 300 pounds brought him a bonanza of 2,700 pounds more. Now, I can't really say if he told me the truth, but he went on saying that after 2 years, he quit the job and started an automobile showroom in Kabul, which was very disappointing. This is only one example of how things can be mishandled if it is handled by unprofessionals. Probably if you send 8 workers to battlefields, there will be even more problems. Hence, it's not unsurprising that after 60 billion of international aid since 2001 in Afghanistan, Afghanistan still remains one of the poorest countries in the world with one of the worst development indicators. And sadly, corruption and aid ineffectiveness is only part of the bigger weakness. The question that I am asked, the short answer to that is that it really depends on a myriad of national and international actors, as well as what we aim to achieve beyond 2014. But the longer version of the answer is as following. Now, Afghanistan, since it is ostensible establishment as a nation in mid-18th century, has always been dependent on some sort of aid or external resources. At the beginning, they went to the neighboring countries and took it with the power of sword. But when more sophisticated powers arrived in the region, they had to seek for help. That trend continued with the Russians, and it still continues today. The only major difference is that Afghanistan is more dependent today. The dependency of Afghanistan is greater. And it has one of the most hostile geographic features, Afghanistan. It is a predominantly agriculture-based economy, but only 12% of the land is arable, and only 0.2% of Afghanistan land is under permanent crop cover. It is an arid and utterly mountainous country where just below the optimum level of rain and snow will cause an immediate drought, and just above the optimum level will cause floods. So from making roads to establishing and building electricity dams, all factors aside, geographical factors make up the cost per unit in Afghanistan greater than any country in the region. They said it's hard to imagine that any government in Afghanistan can sustain without substantial international assistance. But the more nuanced question is how long this international assistance should be there, and how much should it be there for the Afghan government to stand on its own feet. But in either case, it is necessary to enable the Afghan government to take the lead role of the development agenda in the country. The figures so far show that though it has been an intention of the international community to do that, but in practice, it has not been the highest concern. A study by Lydia Poole shows that civilian aid during 2002 and 2009 was only 9.3% of overall international assistance, whereas the military aid was 84.8%, and only a minor proportion of that was spent through the government of Afghanistan. There are two major reasons given. One is the low absorptive and execution ability of the Afghan government, but also the rampant corruption. They may seem valid, but they have not so far helped the creation of the Afghan ability to take the lead in international development. The sustainability of support to Afghan development also hinges on the mood of Western capitals, to be honest, that are more determined by the political realities in their own capitals, and not much with the realities in the Afghanistan scene. Figures show that $60 billion were pledged so far by the international community up to 2013. But only $39 billion were committed by 2009. So there is a big difference. And out of that, only $20.6 billion were actually dispersed. Out of the top 10 donors, percentage-wise, the US, which is the topmost pledger, is the lowest disperser of the aid. These issues, however, do not negate the substantive progresses that Afghanistan made. From access to healthcare and education to roads and infrastructure, Afghanistan has taken gigantic strides. The National Solidarity Program, a flagship program of Ministry of Rural Rehabilitation and Development, is a good example of effective and participatory community development. It's also a good example of NGO and government partnership. We may need to have similar politically correct and technically sound national projects in the future. On a positive note, the drawdown of international troops may also be an opportunity for development in Afghanistan. It may make a big difference if the savings from the military assistance are allocated to development projects. In the meantime, low military intervention in development will also make the Afghan government and international development actors more focused. A focus that is direly needed given the development challenges in Afghanistan are real and they are big. Afghanistan at the moment is one of the worst places to be a woman. Every 2 hours a mother dies, and almost in half of the Afghan districts there is no female teacher in the schools. Large parts of the peaceful Afghanistan remain too unattractive to receive international help. the predominantly agriculture-based economy in Afghanistan is highly weather dependent, and lack of jobs only add to the number of big populations that are internally displaced and refugees. To conclude, development in Afghanistan needs a breakaway from short-term quick impact and quick fix projects to more integrated, coherent, and national development programs. Such a development will be more effective, but it may not be less costly. And coming back to the story of my acquaintance, and just out of curiosity and also to make the conclusion more interesting, I gave him a call this morning to ask how his business was going. After a year of the the automobile showroom, he started a guest house business too. But both of the businesses are running in red at the moment because Afghans have stopped buying new cars. And also the mushrooming of other guest houses mean that he doesn't have a lot of foreign guests. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jawed. And so, I mean, it sounds to me, and we'll come back to this, that you're saying that, peaceful political transition in part depends upon a continuation of subsidies to the Afghan state and their judicious use. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And so, Matt, let me turn to you, and you will speak to, you're going to address the issue of whether reconciliation with the Taliban is possible, and how, if it is possible, it could be achieved.
Thanks, Michael, for such an easy question. I think, the short answer is, I think it is possible, but I think it will be very difficult and will take a considerable amount of time. I'll just, if I may, identify, 4 factors as to why I think it is possible, another 4 as to why I think it will be difficult.
That's 50 seconds per point. By the way.
Firstly, I think withdrawal of foreign forces actually gives rise to some opportunities in terms of reconciliation. There are many reasons why insurgents fight, but I think one of the most pervasive, in fact probably one of the biggest sources of motivation for the Taliban, is the presence of foreign forces. I think actually many Talibs labour under misapprehensions about why foreign forces are in their country. They see them as invaders and for purposes other than those to, generate stability and promote development and so on. But I think that's a major driver, and of course foreign forces are now withdrawing from Afghanistan. Secondly, I think it's clear that a significant number of senior leaders of the Taliban are interested in the possibilities of a negotiated outcome to the conflict. And let me just say why I think they are interested. Firstly, they're war-weary, and they've suffered very significant losses. They're fatigued from the conflict. They face a lot of pressure, both within their movement and from Afghan communities who are fed up with the war. I think they resent the exile that they suffer and the manipulation, as they see it, by Pakistan for its own purposes geopolitically. I think they're uneasy about the future. They're concerned about the regeneration of an anti-Taliban coalition that is backed by the West and regional states. They also, I think, this group of leaders recognize the constraints that they face. In other words, Afghans have changed in their aspirations and their expectations. Since 2001, they expect the state to do an awful lot in terms of services, whether it's education or health or freedoms, basic freedoms and the right to vote. I think that many of these, what one might call thinking Talibs, realize that they cannot go back to the 90s. Indeed, I think in light of the developments in the Arab world more broadly, they know that they cannot seek to be a legitimate, credible power by seeking to impose an autocratic regime on the people of Afghanistan. In fact, the final point I'd make is, and I think this is often missed, is that many of these figures crave legitimacy. They crave recognition, as they did in the 1990s, actually, although they didn't get it. And I think that actually perhaps gives the international community a little bit of leverage there. I think the third point, the reason why I think reconciliation with the Taliban may be possible is that the United States now is seriously interested in the possibilities of a negotiated outcome. And that did not really happen, I think, in terms of a broad collective policy until the end of 2010, early 2011. I think we've moved away now from the oversimplistic conflation of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. I think that helps in terms of the possibilities for reconciliation. The fourth point is, I think there is some indication that there may be a degree of convergence between some of the major parties to this conflict. I think most of the major parties want to avoid a civil war and actually are concerned about their interests were that to take place. I think there might be degree of convergence from some of the parties on, say, issues such as law and order or national sovereignty. And indeed, there are some indications that the Taliban are reconsidering some of their policies that were deeply unpopular through through their regime. Why will it be unlikely to happen in the near future? I think, first of all, the deep mistrust which exists between the parties to the conflict, which is obviously partly historical, partly, I think, it derives from recent history when certain moves were made towards reconciliation, but were not meant sincerely. In some cases, were designed to divide or undermine the Taliban rather than to reach a settlement. And I think each of the parties doubts the seriousness of the others in terms of their interest in a political settlement. Second factor, I think that on each side, there are elements that are opposed to a negotiated outcome. I think you see that on the Taliban side, where there are hardliners who see this as a betrayal of the jihad. I think on the government side, there are compromises there that many figures do not want to make. And in terms of Pakistan, it may have concerns that it would lose its leverage if a process moves forward without them. Third point, there are procedural, I think largely procedural problems with the way the process has moved forward so far. One is the fact that it is very public. And I think that has led each of the parties, as they make moves, they're having to look behind their backs to justify what they're doing to their constituents. And that is very hard when, in the case of the Taliban, they've always denied that they would ever engage with the United States or the Afghan government. And of course, that is now happening slowly, sometimes informally, sometimes confidentially. But because I think because it's quite a public process, that means this constant justification actually is holding the parties back. I think another procedural process problem, if you like, is the absence of a mediator. And I think given the complexity of this conflict, the depth of mistrust between the parties, I think you do need, if possible, an organization or a state or individuals who can try to bring some order to this process. The fourth point I would make is that the Taliban, there are certainly issues where I think it raises very grave concerns on the part of parts of the Afghan population who, particularly, if you like, in terms of social affairs and in terms of the role of women and in terms of basic freedoms. I think there are many in Afghanistan who are concerned about what the policies of the Taliban actually are. And I think that will make it very difficult to move forward. I have 1 minute left to tell you how this all will be solved. 3 points. I mean, I regret the fact that so far in the conflict there has not been a discussion between the parties about the real issues that are driving the conflict forward. In other words, what the interests of the parties are, what they want, and whether there's a sufficient degree of convergence to really think about a negotiated outcome. And I think the sooner that we can bring that dialogue about, the better. I think, as I indicated earlier, if it was possible for there to be mediation of a kind, to try to avoid some of the misunderstandings that have been apparent in the process so far, I think that could help. And finally, I also think that reconciliation with the Taliban is necessary for stability, but insufficient. There has to be a much bigger process that reaches out to many different elements of Afghan society to try to bring them into a process, ensure that if there was any outcomes, it certainly reflects the aspirations of the country as a whole and not merely the leaders, in some cases one might argue discredited leaders of some of the parties. And I think it also, by the same token, needs to be part of a regional process. It cannot stand alone. It needs the backing, I think, of Afghanistan's neighbours.
Thank you very much indeed. 3 terrific presentations there. I mean, there's 3 things that I think embrace what you've all said. Is first that the withdrawal of the international military actually is creating opportunities as well as risks and perils. Secondly, I think you either said it explicitly or implicitly that a medium to long-term approach is required, that if we set ourselves up to try and sort everything out immediately, it's not going to work, but if you take a longer-term approach and pace ourselves, then things might be possible. And thirdly, we need to be clear about our objectives, and sometimes the clarity of those objectives is missing.